Well, hello. Welcome to another ImagineFX video tutorial. I'm Tom Foster, a comic book artist for 2000 AD and the Judge Dredd magazine, and I'm going to be walking you through some of my techniques and processes of doing chrome effects, as well as other things that are going to be touched upon during the course of the video. It's going to be an interesting one. Nobody else here with me. Typically like to try and get someone else in just to not be completely talking into a void, but this hour's got to get filled one way or the other, so it's just me. But let's talk about what's happening on screen and try and divert attention from that rather uncomfortable fact. Speaking of rather uncomfortable things, we have a naked man here with no genitalia standing in front of a wall. Now, this is Daz Studio 3D software, posing software. It's not really modelling software. Apologies incidentally if you can hear that noise in the background. It's my washing machine. It may get louder as time goes on, as it goes into the spin cycle, so you can look forward to that brief excitement. So what's happening here? I mean, every time I do one of these commentaries, I sort of find myself explaining what Daz 3D is. By now, hopefully you'll have some idea, but of course, this may be your first issue of ImagineFX, or your first in a while. So let's just basically say what it is. It's 3D posing software, which basically means that you tend to take models that already exist, 3D models that already exist, and pose them within the software rather than creating 3D models in the software. You can create very sort of basic models in the software, and I do that sometimes. But for the most part, all these models I'm using, for example, are prefabricated. The figure I'm using there comes standard with Daz. It's one of the Genesis models. The wall in the background is part of an environment set that I bought, as is the gun. Well, no, it's not part of an environment set, but it's also a purchased asset. But I mean, really, you can mock up a scene using pretty much just the default things that come with Daz. I'm just using some slightly more elaborate models in order to have a bit of a shortcut, because obviously doing these tutorials, doing the work itself is only half the battle. I've got to write the article, do a video, do this commentary, be grateful for all that I've done for you, which in this instance, as you will find throughout the course of this commentary, may not be very much at all, because things are going to get boring around about the, I'm going to say, half-hour mark. From the half-hour to 45-minute mark, you may find yourself wanting to mute and listen to some music, or just have a bath, or do something else. But sadly, it's unavoidable. Trying to talk for an hour straight can be a fairly unrewarding proposition, which is why I usually try and get some other people in. But hey ho, nobody was available at short notice, so you're stuck with me. So all I'm doing here, I mean, the tutorial is about chrome effects, but obviously to illustrate how best to utilize chrome effects, it's necessary to rig up some kind of scene in which something chromey is showcased. In this case, a fantasy ray gun, sort of space sci-fi gun, and I had a sort of gun that was similar to the type of thing that I wanted to use in my Daz library, but there's a little bit of customization that needs to be done in order to make it truly mine in any sense. But all these posing options and everything are all fairly straightforward. If you have a tinker around with DAZ Studio, it's all just, you know, sliders of rotation and movement that are very, very user friendly and easy to get to grips with. There isn't a great deal there that should trouble you. I should point out that at some point during the proceedings I am going to be answering questions. I mean, this is obviously a Q&A article, but the question of how to achieve chrome effect is what's being answered at length. But I tend to like to throw it out there to Twitter and Facebook people to see if there's any questions, other questions about the specifics of chrome effect that they would like answered. As yet, well, I can see there's some notifications. I haven't read a lot of the questions yet, so we may get a surprise sort of lucky dip. I normally try and curate them to some degree, but that may not be an option because time may prove to be something of a chisel on my concentration and patience. So we may just have to have a bit of a free-for-all. Now lighting, using just a standard spotlight here, another default with DAZ Studio. I encounter a bit of an issue with the lighting of this scene, and I'm not 100% sure why. If anyone watching this has any more experience of DAZ Studio than I, or even just a different set of experience, perhaps they could explain to me why, try as I might, using the spotlight to try and illuminate a certain part of the wall, there's a portion of it that never seems to want to light up, and I can't figure out for the life of me why. But I do eventually find a way to sort of vaguely overcome that. Maybe I even figured out the cause of the problem while I was doing the DAZ business. I can't remember. But anyway, so we're going to work in DAZ for the first, I don't know, maybe 15-20 minutes of this tutorial. It's been sped up. You know, I don't work quite that quickly. It's maybe sped up somewhere between 2 and 4 times the original speed at which I worked. But this was a relatively straightforward scene to set up. So actually, it probably will be less than 15 minutes we spend in DAZ on this occasion, because all we really want is the gun, the arm with hand, and a little bit of wall in the background with some sort of reasonable lighting settings to try and get a sort of interesting composition going on. But here's what I'm talking about here. I'm pointing my spotlight directly at the wall. I'm even using the spotlight like a camera, so I'm looking exactly where the light should be pointing. And for some reason, the portion of wall is not illuminated. I moved the spotlight back, and it is, fair enough, but couldn't for the life of me figure out what was wrong there. So here I am moving it around, trying to get the lighting working properly. I faff about a bit in general on this one, trying to get the lighting right. I wouldn't say there's anything necessarily to be learned, a great deal to be learned from that, other than, I suppose, try and get to know the software as well as possible. Maybe you won't encounter problems such as these. Yeah, it's moving the wall again. I'm going to take a quick look to see if any of those questions about chrome effects are pertinent to what's going on right now. Let's see. Okay. Yes, a couple of interesting questions so far. Nothing that's going to be too relevant just yet. So let's hold out a little bit longer and try and make this even remotely interesting while you're listening. Be exciting to find out if that happens. But yes, you'll notice that the gun in its current form is not particularly shiny. But once I render it, it's composed of such material that it should. There you go. You see, lots more shiny bits on it than it looked like there were. I am going to, I think, have another attempt at rendering that, maybe, just to get the lighting a little bit better. Or possibly not. Am I just going to take it straight into Photoshop? Am I? It's exciting, I can't remember. Nope, looks like I am going to fiddle around a little bit more with the lighting. Try to get something working. I'm not so much concerned at this point about how the lighting affects the chrome, because that's largely going to be redrawn in Photoshop. This is more about just posing all the things and getting a sense of form. But that's looking a little bit better now. Maybe move the light up a little bit so we've not got as much shadow underneath there. I think that's probably what I'm going to do next. But yes, the chrome effects that are actually present on the model, I'm going to be borrowing a little bit from them, but the way they are right now, they're a little bit complicated. And you'll notice if you've read the article to which this video is ostensibly attached, that's something that generally I recommend a fair bit, is not being too slavish to what would be photorealistic or render realistic in terms of chrome effects, because it can be a little visually complicated and sort of frustrating looking. You want to try and divest yourself of as much unnecessary detail as possible. As I touched on in the other video commentary which I've done for this issue, which sometimes they end up in going in different issues once they've been commissioned, but hopefully my tutorial on lighting or specifically cast shadows will make it into this issue. Here we are, I've moved over to Photoshop now, and you can see I'm just fiddling around with the stamp filter. Now, before I use the stamp filter, I convert the image to a higher DPI. I convert from the default from DAZ Studio is about 72 DPI. I convert to 600 because once I use that stamp filter, if the bigger the image, basically, the more detail I'm going to get out of that stamp filter. And this is much nicer than had I left it at 72 DPI. You're getting, it's quite close to a nice clean outline there. I've done a couple of passes, created a couple of different layers, because the lighting on the figure I preferred at a lower darkness level in the stamp layer, but the lighting on the gun I liked. I think I did 3 passes altogether. One for the lighting on the wall, one for the lighting on the figure, and one for the lighting on the gun. So here I am creating something that sort of vaguely resembles a line drawing. If I were an artist who purely rotoscoped, then this would sort of be something. This would kind of be what my work might look like. But I'm not. I like to draw as much as possible. But I use a bit of tracing, a fair amount of tracing, to get some of the base elements sorted, some of the essential kind of 3D forms sorted, so that I can concentrate on the details, the rendering, any drawing that can't be done as part of a 3D render. It's always nice to get the bald maths of something out of the way as quickly and conveniently as possible. Even in DAZ Studio may seem like a bit of a time guzzler. It does certainly eat into your schedule, but a lot of that time is composing shots, looking for nice ways to shoot things and light things and stuff. So it's still a creative process. And I would rather spend that time in the initial layout stage finding compositions that work, finding lighting that works, rather than just figuring out perspective grids and mathematical stuff, which is not in itself artistic. Which the grids and perspectives that you choose to use are a creative process, but just figuring out the sort of geometry of stuff in itself is not necessarily that artistic, unless you're an artist who specifically plays around with that kind of thing. Here I'm trying my best to draw some relatively convincing chrome effect on the gun. At the moment, I suppose it's going marginally well, and I suppose at this stage the key question is, well, what is governing my decisions about where to put lines and where to not? Well, aside from the fact that I'm trying to get a decent balance of black and white, which is always a consideration, these chrome effects are largely for the sake of, well, A, simplicity, so that they're very easy to read and understand, B, kind of visual attractiveness, so they're pleasing to the eye, C, so that they clearly delineate the shape of the object, as well as communicating that it's shiny, which is a sort of continuation of point A. And D, is there a D? I don't know. Perhaps we'll discover a D as we go along. So yes, but I suppose a basic understanding of form is part of what governs the decision. I mean, to some extent, I'm shading this like I would shade any other three-dimensional object, with the added element that secondary light sources, or which could even be reflected light off of the wall in the background, for instance. Those have a far heavier, more kind of more pronounced influence on the shadows on the gun. So rather than just having sort of my preferred option, which is usually sort of single light source type lighting, where there's areas of light, and then they fall into shadow. Here, there's no real solid shadow. There's always a secondary light source to kind of to juxtapose, I suppose. Is it juxtaposition? I feel like that word gets used a lot for things that don't necessarily merit it. So I apologise if I've offended any bibliophiles. If that is even the right. Oh, how much would that annoy them if I wasn't even using the right word for what they are? Lexicographiles, maybe. People who really like words and the accuracy of words. Pedants. I include myself in that group, although clearly don't have the qualifications to do so. Now I'm adding a little sort of white fringe around the edge here, just to give the image a bit more of a sense of depth. So it's a nice little trick in line art when you want to push something forward, as well as giving it a thicker outline itself. Put a little white sort of border around it, just to distinguish it from the things in the background, so there's no conflicting detail there. Nothing in your background is going to be creating a tangent or anything with the object in the foreground, which is always the kind of thing that tends to muddy the waters a little bit when it comes to planes of fields, whatever you want to call them, depth, the great visual depth. How are we doing? We're 19 minutes in, 10 minutes away perhaps from the big depression of not being able to think of anything to say. It's currently 20 to 1 in the morning. A great time to be sitting down and trying to reel off lots of information in a row without pausing at any point. I suppose I couldn't I? I could just have a little longer where I don't say anything. That might help everybody. But I'm going to do my best not to do that, because you've paid your money for the magazine, I assume. If you haven't, get out. But if you have, then I'm going to do my absolute best to give you as much value for that money as possible, provided that you quantify value for money by the amount of hours or amount of time and effort spent putting something together, rather than necessarily the quality of the finished product. And certainly the colour scheme. Oh, we haven't even touched on the colour scheme yet, largely because it has not yet appeared. But when we do, you're going to hear all kinds of apologies from me for that. I'll not go into that now, because I spend quite a bit of time colouring this, so, best save my A material for then. I'm largely refining at this stage the lines that I've created to try and give some sense of shine to this thing. Everywhere it's just a case of, further reflected light sources. I've got a fringe down one edge that's a sort of reflected light source along the top edge there. Then there's another bit in the middle which is maybe a reflection of something else that's light, and then between those, the two dark portions, which, theoretically these are reflections of things that exist in the real world, but don't get too bogged down with trying to actually figure out the mechanics of what's being reflected in the gun, unless that's really important to the image. Like that little lens bit at the front has a bit of extra detail in it that's left over from the actual render, and that could be interesting. You could be seeing, instead of what looks like a sort of landscape there, you could be seeing a character's face looking threatened. You could see the back of somebody's head, or whatever the person is targeting. And that could be quite effective. That's a nice little bit, and that wouldn't be too distorted a reflection, because it's a sort of it's just a disc with maybe a bit of a kind of meniscus on it, if that's the appropriate term. I suppose it's not really. Meniscus is on the surface of like what that's to do with sort of water tension and stuff. Surface tension. I'm really starting to talk out my arse here, I apologise. But yes, so these lines on the gun all kind of theoretically represent either areas of shadow that are being reflected, or dark and light objects that are being reflected in the surface of the gun. But you don't have to be too literal with them, particularly in line drawing. The main thing is to get the message across that the gun is shiny, and any subsequent detail. You might wonder why I'm adding more lines towards the back, rather than having sort of even spread all the way around. It just helps give a sense of being a three-dimensional object, and therefore the farther it gets from the light source, the darker it gets. And if you're working in pure black and white, and with no actual midtones, then a few extra lines, carefully chosen, streamlined lines towards the back can help sell that idea. Also tried to create the impression of either some kind of vent or ridges down the side, just to give you kind of reminiscent of a handgun, and the kind of grip that you get on a handgun for cocking it. But then, of course, on this, it makes no real sense, because it would look very much more like the bit used for the purpose of cocking would be the top portion there, and that's not where this little grip is. So more fool me for not thinking of the functionality of the object. That's an important thing you should always think of. But I'll just say it's a vent. It's a vent for letting out space gas that is generated by the firing of this gun. These guns use a lot of space gas. Little canisters inside that help make the lasers. Can you tell it's the early hours of the morning? So right, what am I doing now? Oh, photo reference, did you see that? That's me! That's me with a gun. A water pistol, to be precise. That's me in my little studio at home. Part of my living room. Which you may have seen in my From the Drawing Board video tutorial. Well, not tutorial, just little video that I made about myself for 2000 AD. Entirely self-indulgent. But yes, my photo reference there being largely for the anatomy of the hand and arm, although I neglected to roll up my sleeves, so it was only really useful for the hand. Again, refining lines here. I don't really tend to use fancy brush settings or line making options in Photoshop. If I wanted to do that, I'd probably go over and use Clip Studio Paint or whatever it's called now. But this process, I tend to just try and use very, very rudimentary options, the very kind of standard brush tools. I think I'm using the pen tool, in fact, so that or pencil tool, so that I don't, so I get clear cut black and white rather than little fuzzy edges that you get with the brush tool. Oh, I'm sorry. It must come as a great relief to regular listeners of my commentary that a yawn is the worst that they have to deal with, rather than the incessant sneezing and sniffing which normally accompanies these things. For once, I'm in relatively rude health. I normally do video tutorials off the back of some big comics project that I've been working on, and my immune system tends to go down the toilet, as well as a lot of other things, while my immune system's low. In a more literal sense, of course. Using the marquee tool here to just get slightly more defined edge to those lines rather than them being all raggedy from going freehand with my fairly rubbish graphics tablets. About 10 years old, and it's you know, it's just a whack-on bamboo. About 30 quid or something at the time. It needs replacing, I think, at some point. At some point I need to use something a bit more sophisticated. But as I always say on these commentaries, it goes to show you that these results, these, well, professional enough to be published in this magazine anyway, results are available to you with fairly limited resources. Just trying to sort out the background a little bit so that it's not overpowering the gun in the foreground. At this stage, I'm still under the impression that this is going to be a black and white piece. I had braced myself for the possibility that I might have to do it in colour. Sometimes I'll submit these black and white things and they'll get the thumbs up as they are, but sometimes the ImagineFX folks like to put a little bit extra colour in there, and I can completely understand that instinct, particularly when I have two tutorials in this issue, and one of them is quite definitely a black and white piece. So I certainly did not object to adding a bit of colour in this one, but as you'll find out, I quite heartily objected to some of my own decisions during the course of that. In fact, if you think the colours that are currently on display in the finished article are bad, then oh boy, just wait till you see the formative stages. Wait till you see what I went through to get to that stage, what I rejected. Can you imagine? Yeah. So what am I talking about? Well, let's maybe take a question. If I can. B. Philby on, or Benjamin A. Philby on Twitter asks, that's somebody else sending me a Facebook message just as right. Anyway, asks, how do you go about rendering more radiant, weaker lighting on chrome-ish materials? Now hang on just one second. in order to look up some more of these questions. I am going to answer the first one, obviously, but in order to look up more of these questions, I'm just going to have to briefly pause the commentary and video at the same time. Can I pull it off? Let's find out. I'm back! Sorry about that brief interlude there. Couldn't be helped. So the question was, how do you go about rendering more radiant, weaker lighting on chromish materials? Well, that's quite an advanced question, Benjamin. The answer is probably, and when it comes to line drawing, I don't. I always tend to make the lighting or at least the kind of reflection effects on chrome materials as sort of dramatic and emphasized as possible. I suppose. Well, no. I suppose there is room for a little bit of scope there, or scope for a little bit of room. I've gone for uber shiny, you know. But if the lighting conditions were different, or if it was slightly duller, less shiny surface, then, you know, maybe I'd have got rid of that middle line there, the one most central to the gun, if you like, the one that kind of runs along the edge of it towards the little lens. And when I say the edge, it's very difficult without actually having any kind of using visual indication as I speak. I'll tell you what. I'll point it out when I adjust it slightly with the little cursor thingy. It's going around different lines. Is it ever going to happen? Am I ever going to touch that line again, or is it fully realized? I don't know if it is. Oh no! Well, most of you will probably know which line I mean. It's the one that I'm not touching at all. But yes, I would maybe have excluded that and just put like one or two little thin lines down the edge of the gun, and that would have given the impression of a little bit of shine. But in this instance, more lines, thicker lines, higher contrast. That's usually the way you would deal with different levels of radiance and strong or weak lighting. It's the way I would do it anyway, in a line drawing. If I were digitally painting, doing fully rendered stuff, then I might approach it quite differently. I might, a lot more of that work might be done with colour. In fact, here, I suppose the colour work in this does do something to dull the effects of the reasonably focused and contrasting black and white work, but that's my own fault. I have to bite the bullet, or in this case, laser blast on that one. Just adding a bit of sort of background texture here. Not exactly a lighting effect, more just a kind of compositional effect, design element. Just trying to create some sense of balance between all this white area, which is there to emphasize the gun, and have a sort of vignette where it fades out towards the edges. So it can be a pleasing effect. I mean, I'm doing it quite scrappily here, but of course the idea is just to demonstrate the principles of these drawings, rather than necessarily to produce a fully polished, if you'll excuse the wordplay, fully polished piece of artwork. So this is getting close now to being the finished black and white piece which I initially submitted. And at this point you're probably thinking, Tom, why you be so hard on yourself? It's great, it looks fantastic. And well, I appreciate that. That's very sweet of you. it's, you know, it's all right. It's mediocre. It's only like I say, an illustration of a basic principle. There's no need to go falling over yourself to fawn over me. But at this stage, it's relatively effective, compelling, black and white, stark. Just, you know, touching up some of these details here, make all the lines a little bit stronger, make everything pop. Fantastic. But then soon the rogue element of colour will enter the equation. And, I mean, as you'll see from the timing of this video, we're only just past the halfway mark. Or, well, a little bit past it, but you know. For the colour stage, which should be one of the quicker stages, certainly quicker than the drawing, to be introducing that colour stage quite so soon may seem alarming to you. But don't be frightened. It's purely as a result of my ineptitude during the colour stage of this process. I'm vaguely experienced when it comes to colour. I've done a certain amount of colour work for 2000 AD and Judge Dredd. Probably, well, not quite as much colour work as I have done black and white, but you know, a reasonable amount. Enough to fool you into thinking that I know what I'm talking about. But it's still perhaps my weakest suit. So, oh, there was me again. It's exciting. So when it comes to adding the colour here, there's a lot of trial and error, because I'm still figuring things out. I haven't got a colour process, by which I mean technique rather than printing process. I haven't got a colour technique worked out completely yet that I use every time. You know, I still experiment with everything, every project, with the colours. But this I think is now is the black and white piece finished. That's why I'm cropping it. So at this stage, after a few saves and stuff, there we go. Look, colour. Oh no, what's going to happen now? I've multiplied the layer that my final drawing is on, and now I'm creating a second layer underneath, in which I'll put my colour flats, which basically means just the broad areas of colour that delineate what sort of object is coloured differently from the other. So here I'm picking out the arm and gun, which will be coloured differently from the background. And then I will hit the paint bucket tool after choosing a colour that I think I might like. There we go. And now separate the gun from the arm, and hit the paint bucket tool again after choosing another colour. And bam! We have, for all intents and purposes, our kind of key flats. But I don't like this at the moment. I don't like the finished thing, but I don't like it right now either, because there's no contrast in this image, and this will prove to be the biggest problem through the course of this. I have to have the focal point of the image, which is the gun, stand out, and yet it's going to be reflecting the lighting conditions around it, which means it sort of has to stand out, but also in a way not stand out, because it's got to be the same colours as the background to some extent, which proves to be a bit of a problem. Ultimately, I sort of get around it by making the little lens bit at the front a different colour, and kind of having a kind of sunburst effect on the background so that it gets lighter towards the middle. But at the moment, I'm in all kinds of trouble here. I don't know what I'm doing. Look at this red and sort of greyish purple. It just looks horrible. Oh God! And look at that. It's even worse with the blue and everything. This is currently a disaster area. Right now, what you're looking at is a disaster area, and I'm doing my best to do damage limitation here, but there's all sorts of problems going on. The reason the blue has even made any kind of appearance is because I want to try and have a little bit of the object's true color poke through, because that I think that might, you know, give it that little bit of contrast and make it a little bit more visually pleasing. Boy, is that a misguided attempt for the most part. At the moment, at least, I have created some kind of contrast in the image, but of course now the gun isn't reflecting the lighting conditions really at all. So that's a problem. So now I try and do that again, and again this horrible mash, this disgusting combination of greyish blue and bright red. I mean, it's horrible. I mean, I'm achieving something. I'm starting to achieve something that looks almost like a reflective surface, but it's, I mean, it's ghastly. And what's the point? You know, if it's one thing for it to look sort of vaguely convincing or whatever, but if it's visually unappealing, then it's a failure. I mean, unless you're specifically going out of your way to make your audience feel unpleasant and uncomfortable. I am not a big fan of visuals that are you know, unattractive. I mean, unattractive subject matter, that's a different story, but the visual itself being unattractive is typically inexcusable. I'm going to move the microphone here just a little bit. I say microphone, it's an iPad, but it has a microphone built in. So you may notice now that there's a slight difference in the tenor of my voice, but I'm sitting in a more comfortable position now, so hopefully the next 15 minutes or so... Is that all we've got left? I really hope so. 17 minutes! We're actually doing not bad. I mean, I say we're doing not bad. What I mean is, I've managed to talk consistently for the last 42.5 minutes. Not necessarily that any of it's been any good, but time has passed, which is fantastic. There you see I've done the sunburst effect, and that's certainly made a difference in terms of how much I can make the gun kind of pop. Because now I'm setting the kind of reddy orange against the yellowy orange, rather than just try to set red against red or whatever. But there, in my hubris, I've attempted to get the grey back in. And that's not really working. And I'm trying to create colour flats with just sketchily using the brush tool, which is something that ends up costing me far more time later on. So yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of experimenting going on, colours changing all the time. But if you take one lesson out of this, I guess it should be that even the professionals get it wrong. Which is probably not a very good lesson, because it might encourage you to sort of rest on your laurels a little bit, if you're an amateur or a professional, and think, oh, it's okay to get it wrong. But I suppose the mantra of being a professional is to keep reminding yourself that it's not okay to get it wrong. I mean, it is okay. You could forgive yourself for getting it wrong. But professionalism was all about being consistent and getting it right as often as possible. But despite our better efforts, even we, as supposed exemplars of the form, can make horrible, horrible mistakes, such as the colouring choices that I may or may not have made on this image. I haven't seen the finished image for a wee while, so it'll be interesting to see what I end up with here. I had a little bit of a break between doing the recording the video and actually doing the commentary, so we'll see how disappointed in myself I ultimately am. Or I am ultimately. This is looking a bit better at the moment. I'm not typically a fan of having all of these warm colours, just because I tend to find that it's nice to have a balance of warm and cool in an image, but it's not always possible, really, is it, if you're trying to do convincing lighting. I'm still a bit conflicted on the whole lighting for storytelling thing. You know, when I'm colouring for covers, everything's sort of like studio lighting, everything's its true colour, you know, but when you're colouring for storytelling, you're colouring for kind of mood and atmosphere and everything, so the colours that you're using in the scene tend to, and your kind of lighting choices tend to influence every colour on the page rather than just the sort of background stuff. But look, see how often I'm changing this stuff and how dramatically I'm changing it. That's the good thing about having a flats layer is that you can just select a flats layer there. Is that you can just select the areas you want to work in and kind of play about as much as possible. But I mean, this thing's changing every few seconds. Admittedly, at a sped up pace. So while I, you know, play around trying to get the right result, let's consult Twitter again, see what question we've got. Amy Mackay on Twitter asks, how do you draw bald people in the brackets chrome domes and make them look convincingly attractive? Well, I mean there are two ways of going about that. One is that you could of course just make their head progressively shinier, in attempts to create some kind of luster. But of course, that can have the adverse effect of repelling people as it does light. And blinding them. But then, of course, blinding somebody isn't necessarily a bad idea when you're struggling with the issues of personal aesthetics. Typically, my approach would be to make bald people attractive. I don't know, symmetrical features, a slightly feminine look, even with the male characters. I mean, you know, I'm a relatively experienced artist, but you know, I'm not a miracle worker. Right, so I've added a little fringe of red down the bottom here. That's my concession to reflecting the red of the background. And I think that aspect is sort of working okay now. The rest of the colours look a bit horrible still. But the wee bit of reflected red, I think, is a nice little compromise in terms of keeping the gun sort of fairly contrasting with the background and still having it sort of acknowledge the background colours to show that it's a reflective surface. But there's still a bit more work to go in terms of getting the colour scheme right. I'm a bit happier with that sort of greenish blue now on those kind of details at the front. This is starting to look a little bit better now. It's just a question of sort of trying to find a subtle grade of a compromise between the background colours and the true colour of the gun, which is a sort of, I suppose, greyish colour, being a silvery chrome. That's a suggestion anyway. But I suppose really silvery chrome tends to just be almost a total reflection of whatever colours are around it. But that always seems to give the kind of impression of being a sort of silvery grey colour. So I've kind of stuck to that a little bit. These red bits here are awful currently. I don't mean the lens and the little bit. I mean the red edges on the kind of muzzle of the gun. They're currently ruining it. I need to add a little bit of white highlight as well. That might help. Yeah, there we go. I'm sort of adding a little bit of reflected detail on that little kind of lip at the edge of the muzzle, which currently looks ghastly because it's that horrible combination of grey and red, but will hopefully work a little bit better. I've even added an extra little bit of black at this stage, just to highlight that even more. But there we go. I'm adding a few kind of whitish highlights there just to sell the reflectiveness of it even more. As much contrast as possible, as always, to create the look of a shinier surface. And the reason for that, of course, is that a shinier surface reflects light more effectively than a dull surface, which means that your dark and light hues that are reflected off of it are sort of purer and more strong. If you take a photograph and import it into Photoshop and apply the stamp filter or the threshold filter, you'll notice that the darker you go, and the thicker the blacks and the higher the contrast, the more kind of, I guess, metallic everything looks, because it seems to be reflecting the things that are. Or if you turn up the contrast, and then apply the stamp filter, I don't know. Maybe that's not true. Maybe I'm just running out of things to say again. But this is starting to look almost okay. I mean, I still hate the color scheme. I hate this sort of greyish, reddy color. It's horrible. And having it against the sort of lighter grey there at the top of the gun, it's still a bit ghastly. But you know, sometimes the mark of a professional is being able to say, it's good enough. I'm sure my editors would be delighted to hear that. Yeah, so what? It's good enough. Give me more money. I did my best. I really did. I spent longer on this one than I did the lighting one. But I spent maybe even twice as long on this one. Might be more than that. Who knows? I mean, I could easily find out. It's all on video. Just need to go back to the original speed. And I'll find out. But guess who can't be bothered to do that? Everybody would be the answer. Yeah. So, 6 minutes left. What have we learned? We've learned that high contrast is usually the best bet when you're trying to communicate chrome on a model. Smoothness, simplicity, elegance, style are all features which did not appear in this commentary. But in the image itself, perhaps to some degree, they're all important to try and get across the shiny textures. The original title for this video and article was going to be Shiny Gun, but you know, that wasn't really a question. Plus I thought that it might sound a bit daft. Now, sort of in a more subdued way, having the arm reflect the colours of lighting in the image as well. It influences the overall colour of the arm less, but it still does have an influence. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry for my yawning. It's not through boredom, merely tiredness. Busy is the life of the comic book artist. Actually, I've just had a few days off, so I really shouldn't be that tired. I think this is kind of getting there. I mean, I suppose you could fob off the slightly kind of unpleasant looking colours to being some kind of atmosphere in the image. Personally, it is missing. I do think it's missing some cool tones, maybe, and the combination of colours is a bit unattractive, quite unattractive. Actually, it reminds me of 90s comics, like particularly kind of 90s, like maybe UK Marvel type stuff. That's all sort of grading and sort of slightly harsh tones and things. Or like the colouring you would see on a comic in maybe 1998, like a Spider-Man 2099, late in the run, something like that. Apologies for that. But there I tidied up the little sort of yellowy white highlight on the gun there, just to keep that consistent with the rest of the lines, rather than being all kind of raggedy and drawn looking. A rare instance of me kind of using the lasso tool, the kind of gradient lasso effect. I don't really like that effect very much, but for a chrome object, I guess it's justifiable. How are we doing? 2 minutes 20 left. Nearly there. So well done if you stuck it out this far. You've got to the sort of secret bits, the bits that nobody else gets to hear. Not close enough to the end that if somebody'd skipped right to the end, they would hear them. But now it's that little hinterland where I tell you one special little secret that will change the way you draw forever. And that secret is work really hard. That's rubbish, isn't it? You knew that already. That's the last thing you want to hear if you're reading ImagineFX. Work really hard. You want to find ways to. The whole point of this magazine is to say, right, okay, we understand that you want to work hard, but you can't work in a vacuum. What will help you? It's the biggest thing that people say, that artists say at conventions, is when they're asked, what do I do to get to get better at drawing comics or to get published, and they always say, well, it's just hard work and drawing and doing it every day and something. And that's not, I mean, that's true, but it doesn't really help, because it's sort of, everybody knows that the harder you work, the better you get, usually. What those comic book artists are saying is, I had to work really hard. I didn't just get better overnight. I know you didn't get better overnight, but, every artist has little realizations that make the job easier as time goes by. And I'm no exception. I've had ones as well. But it looks like we're not going to have time for any of them. So thank you very much for joining me on this tutorial. I always enjoy doing them. Look me up on Twitter if you fancy. And I'll see you next time. Bye.